Hey there, this is Dr. Karen Shackleford, and I'm here with Dr. Nick Bowman, who has graciously agreed to do a little talk, a little interview about what to do when you're a grad student and you're trying to figure out what are the journals in the field, which one should I be thinking about when I'm going to select a journal to submit my research to. So Nick, I was joking with you before this interview that you're actually the editor of all those journals. I'm kidding. You have several editorial jobs. So it's almost that way. But what do you think of when you think of the major journals in media psychology?
Yeah, when I think of the major journals in media psychology, where I get the list from is a combination of what do I notice when I'm reading things where it's being published, right? And where am I seeing the most traction in terms of citation change? A lot of students will notice over the years as you do your work, you'll continually cite the same logics and the same theories, and you kind of see a track. And of course, impact factors and citation numbers. So for me, the journals I tend to think of as the core media psychology journals would be Media Psychology, Psychology of Popular Media, Journal of Media Psychology, New Media and Society. Those are a mix of journals that are both sponsored by the APA and also have connections with the Media and Communication side, International Communication Association. And that's not too surprising because the study of the media side of media psychology, you saw a lot of evolution from comm scholars who were doing media research like in the 40s and 50s, slowly coming into psychology theory, psychology programs, and epistemologies and leading towards that track. And then, of course, you have the psychological roots of media psychology, which would be APA sponsored. But those are the journals that come to mind. Technology Minded Behavior is another one that is relatively new. I would say when I'm thinking about my papers, those journals, so, in the acronyms, MP, JMP, PPM, NMS, and TMB, that tends to be like my go-to list whenever I'm thinking about where I'm going to publish something. I'd say almost always. Those are all journals that are indexed, that have highly cited, and you're going to notice the people you read are in those journals frequently.
Yep, well, that's great. Now, what about, you mentioned tech-minded behavior. Is there, if you were doing something that was highly tech-oriented, is there anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, so if I was doing work more on sort of the technological features that lead to audience impact and how people process information, TMB is a new one because they're one of, I think, they're APA's newest journal. They're unique because I think they're the only open access journal. And so they have a very different review cycle in terms of it's a single anonymous review. They charge a publication fee to cover the expenses of the journal. But TMB is one that's been really quick to review. I'm one of their associate editors, and we usually have month turnarounds. The New Media and Society, NMS, that is one that I definitely send tech papers to. They're very interested in the intersection of emerging media and the user experience. We all joke around that we hate the term new media because it's always changing. At the same time, that's why the journal's good, because all the new stuff goes there. If I had to expand out a little bit, I might consider Computers and Human Behavior, CHB. That one works really well, or Mobile Media and Communication, MMC. These are journals that also take, and what they want to hear, just using a technology is not enough to be a tech paper. They want to know what is it about the features of that technology or the affordances of those features that impact the experience. But those are also journals that come to mind. One that's kind of a catch-all is called Communication Research Reports. It's a very short journal. They only publish 4,000 word articles. But they're a bit of a catch-all, and they tend to publish a lot of tech as well.
So I do narrative work, and so there's some journals that that sound very different than the ones that we're talking about, like the Journal of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, and Poetics.
Yeah, I was going to mention Poetics. Yeah,
we're leaning to the humanities side. In fact, what I try to coach my students sometimes is, you have to understand if they really want a humanities article or if they really want a social science article, because they're at that nexus. So that just a couple to throw out. So here's a question for you. You are one of those publishers that is just so prolific, you're killing it out there. What if you're a new graduate student and I have a talk that I'm giving that it's about you look up their rejection rates, and some of them are like, 92% or
Yeah,
things
the
like
journal
that.
I edit is currently Journal of Media Psychology is 90%.
Yeah.
You know,
So what would you do? And I'm not saying tell me a crappy journal. I'm saying tell me a journal that if you really want to get something published, you need something on your CV, and you're new to the game, and
sure.
you want to think about it from that perspective, where you're not just too scared to submit.
If you're getting your feet wet and trying to sort out just the practice of publications, I tend to look at three things. One of them is going to be turnaround rates, right? The journals that are faster tend to be harder to get into, but they also tend to give better feedback. So you get a desk reject from an editor at Media Psychology, but you get a 2-page letter explaining why, and that feedback can help you move into somewhere else. I look for journals that publish shorter manuscripts. So, I mentioned CRR, Communication Research Reports. And the reason the shorter manuscripts are interesting is because they help you flesh out your basic ideas. I often call that signal detection research. One of the things, and as an editor, you've seen this, sometimes papers get themselves in trouble. They go too far, they protest too much, or they pad too much. And the finding's kind of interesting, and it's probably interesting for 3,500 words, but it's not interesting for 8,000 words. Another one is looking for conferences that publish proceedings. So CHI, Computers and Human Interaction, or some of the IEEE conferences, and even Technology Minded Behavior. If they used to have a conference, Technology Minded Society. I think COVID disrupted it, but the hope is to bring it back online. They were a proceeding style. And that's a way to get your papers into the conversation, into the zeitgeist, in a relatively lightweight way that allow you to build on the findings without having to have too much padding and elaboration for something that may not be there. A small class project won't have the sample size and the power analysis, or the themes that are probably going to make a huge impact. In fact, even my own journal, JMP, even though we have a 90% rejection rate, it's much lower for the reports. We don't get as many reports. And when the reports do come in, they're typically pretty strong because they're being reviewed a little differently. They're being reviewed for, do they make an incremental contribution? And the expectation is not that they are, nature, right? That's not, and the nice thing, at least in my experience, I don't get the impression that people downgrade it because it's a report. Like on your CV, on your, conversations with colleagues, publication is a publication. Some people will distinguish between proceedings and journals, but those work out. So on that line, it's not so much that I think I have target journals, but I would say the ones that accept smaller papers, the ones that just have multiple options. Special issues can be a nice way to find traction in a journal where the review cycle is more nuanced. And so special issue rejection rates tend to be lower, in part because the topic is more focal, right? With my journal, the rejection rate for special issues is around 50%.
Yeah.
And maybe the last thing I would think of is topic specifics. So for example, the journal Games and Culture, and, because it's more nuanced, they tend to get fewer submissions, which just means by natural, they're not going to have as high of a rejection rate. So if you're working with a specific tech, the journal Presence is good for VR research, right? Or Convergence is good for technology, and they're very nuanced. Even CHB a little bit is a bit more nuanced, and so they're already going to have a narrow track.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, but after I ask you, I'm going to give you some time to think, because I'm going to answer it for my students. Okay, so think back, or just imagine yourself as brand new to the publishing game. You know how it is. We have 0 publications on your CV, and it's a publisher parish. You got to get something on there. I'm going to give you some, not you, you're good. I'm going to give my students some advice on some things that I think about with publication. Then I'm going to ask you just if there's any advice that you would have for people entering. So my advice is this. It's what I'm going to say is hard for you to do from the beginning, but to have it as a goal, I think, is important. I remember really, really deeply the first time I was ever away from Craig, my mentor, doing the whole thing on my own. And Craig is just incredibly knowledgeable about publishing. So I'm doing the whole thing on my own. I don't even have grad students. I have undergrads. I started a lab. And the first paper I submitted, it was a dicey review. Let's say this, I've told the story a bunch of times, quick version. It was to sex roles. I had one reviewer that just said, this is unreadable, but the editor said, that's all they said. They didn't give me any specifics. Whoever you are, not nice. But I just, stuck it out. The editor liked it. They asked for a revision. I stuck it out. I revised based on the editor's comments since I didn't have any feedback from the reviewer. And it got published, and then later I got it, years later, I got a note saying it was in the top 20 most downloaded articles from that journal. So that's just my way of saying it is going to suck. You will think, oh God, I should have gone to another profession. I can't do this. I'm an imposter, whatever it is. My thing, for some reason, I always think I should have been a caterer. Like, why did I do this? This sucks. I don't want to do this. Or when I was younger, I would think, oh God, I'm a crap researcher. I'm now realizing that now. So you take it very personally from the beginning, and every little thing can sting you. But I swear to you, now I'm like a woman of steel, because you cannot say anything to faze me. I don't care. And I will also do whatever you say, within reason. Right. So it takes time, and it will feel personal, and it will feel like you are failing or can't do it. But if you believe in yourself, like, it hurt me, but I believe that I'm smart and capable. So I'm just going to keep trying, because the only thing, if you stop trying, then you're going to fail. So I would say it's not going to feel great, but it will feel better over time. And I used to teach out of this book called Things I Never Told You in Grad School. And one of the things was, you think you're successful because you're smart. It's because you persevere, like you stick in there. And that is absolutely the fact. Like, there are a lot of smart people who just give up, you got to keep fighting. That's my advice.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a couple of things I can share. I mean, one is I just got a review 3 days ago. There was an accept that was terrible. And I print off my bad reviews and keep them on my wall. They're nice, humbling reminders. What
like
people
if you
don't
start
like.
To feel like you're about to fly or something. Yeah.
It is like, okay, there it is. Right. There's, and what I often tell folks is that, I mean, first we have to remember that we are in a field of rejection. If you're doing research from a falsifiable paradigm, that's what we do for a living. We fail to reject things, or we reject them. So you have to accept that sort of the same types of thoughts we often put into our research from like a social science perspective, or even a humanities perspective. You're trying to unpack, different systems of thinking and of reality. The point is, science is not easy. It's a bit audacious for us to think that we can just solve every problem if we sit in our chair long enough and collect some data. So for me, it's always been, I see it more as a humbling moment that we're trying to understand human complexity. And I talk to my colleagues in the hard sciences. And of course, they, you would think they would look down on psychology and social science. You'd be surprised. They often talk about how they can't imagine doing science in a paradigm where the subjects can do whatever the hell they want.
Exactly.
You don't have to ask a shuttle what its dispositions towards aggression are on its way up to the moon. It just goes to the moon.
Dishes are much easier to deal with than.
That's right. They're like, we actually have a sealed laboratory. We can put these two molecules and this molecule together, and we get a new one. So when you start thinking about how incredibly hard social science is, factored in with the fact that it's people doing the science and we study people for a living, and then factored in, rejection rates that are in the 80 to 90% range. What you have to start realizing is it's hard to make a knowledge claim. And every single knowledge claim should be hard to make. And I say that because in a way, it's kind of like I could be mad, to use a sports analogy. I used to be a sports writer. I could be mad at the catcher behind me yelling in my ear and making fun of me. But at some point, they're going to do that no matter what. I have to hit the ball. And you have to separate those two things. You know, the ball coming in for me is the thing I'm trying to solve and reliably put somewhere. And that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing for us to do. It is, we never accept a study on its face. Remember, all of our science rests on the assumption asterisk until somebody rejects this. I mean, 100 years ago, we had models of the atom that were like plum pudding, and there's jelly in there, and you can pull out molecules. And then someone went, nope, never mind. So where I'm going with this with this serpentine discussion is that this is a sticky, audacious, tough thing we're trying to understand humans. And as easy as to say to look the other way, it's work. You know, I'm wearing my flannel shirt today with like my waffle button up because it's cold outside. It's a surprisingly blue collar job when it comes to tenacity, when it comes to the stick to itiveness, going through the bricks until they finally break. And I think what happens for many of us, we're so used to being on top of our game for so long that we get smacked and we get humbled, right? So all of that is to say, there are going to be people who are bad actors. And fortunately, we're at a time in our field where editors and others are starting to call those things out. The nice thing is the difficulties come from the science itself. As long as you have reasoned actions that you're taking in your logic, in your methods, in your results, and in your discussions, you will always have a rebuttal. And if you have a rebuttal, more times than not, you're going to be given the floor. I just submitted a paper last week. The letter of response was 17 pages long. Mm-hmm. The paper was 20 pages long. It was accepted by the editor. And they just wrote, you've clearly answered the questions, right?
Yeah, I have to say a pet peeve of mine, and it doesn't happen very often at all, is when someone feels like they can blow off that process, because I do not blow off that process. I'm going to
you have to respect it. Yeah.
You're not immune to having to respond to those questions.
That's right. That's right. And it's the review process is a dialogue. And I wish more people accepted that. Part of that is editors have to encourage that. I know you certainly do. I've submitted papers to PPM before. I do as well. But even if they don't, I just don't give them the option. I mean, if I have a paper and I get comments, those are comments on my work. I want to tell you what I was thinking. And so my paper is standing on its own. It's what I want the world to see. The letter is me unpacking it to your bespoke questions. It's really no different than if I was talking to a journalist or teaching it in a class to a student or talking to somebody at the pub who happened to come across one of my papers, which doesn't happen, but it could happen, right? So it really is, science is not final. Science is not easy, but the hard is the science, right? I only say that because I think it doesn't normalize rejection, but it makes it an expected outcome. No more than not every study I've done worked. Right. The fail CV kind of thing. As for the personal attacks, those are things where I don't have a problem responding back to them. Now I'm privileged. I'm in a tenured position, but people should feel empowered to speak to editors. I think we are seeing a change in the wind in terms of what's considered acceptable discourse and not. But yeah, it's again, to use baseball, and I apologize if I lose people along the way, but there's an old saying called the Mendoza line, and it's the lowest batting average you can have and still be a professional athlete. That line is 22%. If you hit 22% of the baseballs, you get paid millions. We're not so different. We're in a high skill, high performance job. You have to realize you will get it wrong, and you will get it right in your career, and then 20 years later discover that you were wrong. Right. So those are the things that I tell students, and that's the part that makes it fun, because when you adopt that philosophy, then you start thinking internally. What are my checks and balances? What am I doing to ensure that I'm not as wrong as somebody else? And I guess on the flip side, we have to remember we're not always right. most of us work in a paradigm where we don't accept positive, right? Like that's just not a vocabulary word for us. We are the least wrong given this data and this experience.
Right.
So there's a lot of traction between what we do theoretically, what we do operationally, and how that represents the peer review process.
Well, you remind me that I'm at a point in my career where I feel very comfortable. I have achieved far more than I ever thought is humanly possible. In other words, I have nothing to prove to anyone.
Yeah.
And that puts me, I mean, to me, that's based on my standard. Every person will have, if they thought about me at all, a different perspective on that. But for me, that's where it is. So, but at the same time, I absolutely feel like I am at my most useful right now because of all the work that I've done and what's in my head.
Mhm.
But I'm also the most stuck in a way that I've ever been. I'm working on this theoretical paper and it keeps going around and around and around. But I keep having to challenge myself. What am I really trying to say here? And different times I'll start at ground zero again, like, all right, is this even right? Was I wrong this entire time? These years I've been struggling with this thing because
I tend to share those stories a lot with my students where I'm like, you may have seen what I've done, but you don't see what I'm doing. And it's not that it gets easier, it's just that we get better, but then we take on harder questions. And that's where you're at, right? You're taking on fundamental questions of identification in a field that's wrestled with this for 2 decades. So in a sense, like you reset, like you take on, it's like taking on the very top challenge in a video game that taxes every single one of your skills, plus some new ones you didn't even know you needed. And I think
and I'm at the phase where Bowser keeps like thrashing me.
Yeah, you're like, what am I supposed to do now? And so when I scale that down for students, I just tell them, relatively speaking, we are at the same stages. And I think when they realize that it's not them, and even if you get it wrong, it's not you. You can do a bad study. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. Reviewers don't always get that, but we have to remember it's not, and I'm giving them credit. It's not that the reviewer actually hates you. They don't know you. They're teachers. They're professors.
Sometimes they do, but we're not going to get into that.
That's fair. That's very fair. The field gets smaller and you start seeing the cracks shine through. But yeah, sometimes they just get agitated, and we're not always very graceful people, right? So, I do try to use the glass house, glass stone, stones analogy before I get too mad at a review. Sometimes I do the classic walk away for a day and then come back to it, and that works really well. But sometimes is it the tone or is it the critique that we don't like? Right. And we just have to realize we are interrogators by definition. We interrogate for a living. My hope in some ways is that you are your own biggest critic, because once you adopt that mindset, you just don't make any mistakes, but more importantly, it becomes transactional and not personal. And I realize that,
I don't care what you say to me, just what do you want?
And it's easy to say that, but it has to be that way. I mean, again, I think of athletes who get screamed at and death threats on social media and things like this, it's part and parcel of the gig a little bit.
Yeah, I just watched a documentary about Nancy Pelosi. They're saying you're Satan and everything. She's just like, I'm getting this Obamacare passed. Right.
Yeah. So it's, the lumps aren't always there to be lumps. It's just that what we're doing is lumpy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I get concerned sometimes because I'm always teaching graduate students that I tell them these types of things. And then I think this sounds like it really sucks. Like you don't want to be a psychologist, right. But I try to end at least with a little bit of the good side, which is just, first of all, Nick and I, by the way, are both from Arnold Mo, which is not like a swanky place, right? That's fine. But the whole, and me, just for my own personal story, growing up as a little girl in the 70s and things like that, where girls were still like a lady doctor, right. And all that kind of stuff. Just the fact that I get to have my voice out there in the world is huge to me, that people are listening to me, hearing something that I have to say. And this is, use the word bespoke while ago, it is like a fancy career, right?
Sure.
I work in ideas, you work in ideas and methods and other things, but this is a privilege. It's absolutely a full-on privilege. So we're not being lazy about it. We're working very hard to get this done. But it's a privilege to work in ideas, to have people ask you, like I've given congressional testimony and things. The government is asking me stuff, like that's amazing for a little girl from Arnold Moe who never knew any of this was going to happen to her. And as hard as sometimes the review process can be, I will say two things. One, most of the time when you step away, if you're feeling agitated at all, and you come back, you think they are so right. And thank God they told me that, because this is getting better. And you only have one brain, and you're going to tend to just keep seeing what you're seeing. You need somebody else to tell you in order to make it better. So I owe a lot to, there's one reviewer I constantly think of from simulation and gaming, like that dude super helped me. And I don't know. Had a couple of those, I loved what that person said. It really gave me a lot of stuff, a lot of food for thought. But the other thing is, when you go through this struggle, and I love to use analogies, it's kind of like an actor trying out, they try out for 200 shows and they're in one, but they're in that show. And when your name gets put in print, that is the most thrilling thing in the world to me, just to see that in print, to see your ideas in print. That coupled with people saying, I read your stuff and let's talk about it. That's my very favorite thing. Or that
I get giddy today. I mean, 3 days ago, I got a journal acceptance. And for context, for folks on the call, I think it was my 134th. Jeez. It still feels awesome. You're like, yeah, right? Because you have like, we had an idea. We sat down with a team and we thought about hooliganism and soccer and trolling and esports. And we were like, I wonder if theoretically they're the same thing. No one's thought of that yet. But people have thought of a bunch of other things. So let's go to those giants and stitch their ideas together and add our own idea to the mix and see if we can emerge with a synthesis. And you send that out to your peers and they shred it and you get it back again. And then you write it again and you send it out to your peers and they go, you know what? It's pretty good. People should read this, right? And it goes back to when I was a journalist in Missouri to what I do now. It is a thrill. It is a thrill to know you've made that journey. And in some ways, again, I don't want to normalize abuse, but the idea that the journey makes the end case so much more worthwhile because you know what it takes to make it into that 5%, that 10%. And it's not that every idea, some ideas should probably not make it very far. I have definitely had ideas where I wish I wouldn't have said them ever in public ever. I once gave a talk at a conference and after I was done, people were like vexing me with their eyes. I have never talked about that topic ever again. Like clearly I do not understand it. It is a giddy feeling. It is a worthwhile feeling. And if it's done correctly, you've made a contribution. And we're in an age of great discovery. And we're learning more about humans than ever before. I mean, psychology in the last 100 years, my God, has exploded. And it's only leading us to more questions. So I think you're right. I mean, I do get giddy. Everyone matters. I can honestly say I've never just kicked a paper out because they matter to me. You know, they are, and they matter personally, they matter professionally, but that's the feel, right? And it's almost as if it were cheapened, if it were simple, if it were, I don't want them to be mad, so just let me publish it anyways, it would have been bad science. It would have been bad science, right? So, stand up for your work. Stand behind your work, let others stand in front of your work, right? And then just kind of work through that. And there are going to be times where you put it on the side and you set it aside and who knows what happens to it. It's a thrill. It really is a thrill. It's a thrill that I shouldn't tell people that I would take the amount of money that I would take because I wouldn't get paid as much. And of course, that's an issue in science, but we are starting, most importantly, I think, is that we are entering an age to where the study of humans, as we become more technologically mediated, is paradoxically more important now than ever before. We are right at the stage to make legitimate contributions to industry, to government, because the questions they have aren't about the toys, they're about the people. So it's going to get harder and there's going to be more opportunities.
right? Like the misinformation, disinformation,
Mhm.
vaccine deniers, all of this stuff. That's psychology. It's not.
Yeah.
People sometimes people will say, well, if we just explain it to people, like no, it's not even cognitive.
You ever met people before?
People are,
Yeah, like I don't know
ourselves
about that.
included, but it's, those are very difficult problems. So if you can make a dent, it's incredibly important to try to figure that out. So yeah, it's right. Some people will say like psychology, pah, we all know about that. That's nothing, right? No, it's the
Just the
hard nut
beginning.
to crack. When the facts are all in one direction, and yet, I turn on the weather report and I think, okay, well, Buffalo just got like several feet of snow and Santa Barbara is falling into the ocean, but other than that, it's all cool, So, but people are saying, fine.
Everything's fine. I'm like, I don't think it's fine, but okay.
So we got to figure out what's in those
And
people's heads.
something I want to add, I'm sorry, is at some point the questions to me become the reward. You mentioned it earlier. It is, despite the difficulties and the ongoing struggles in the academy, I'll only say, having worked professionally as well, it's the grass is not greener on the media side of things. But more importantly than that is, and those discussions are important, but the knowledge work is the work. And I think sometimes because of the way the system's set up, because of the way we amplify some voices over others, one of the drawbacks is we lose track of the knowledge work. And if you can center your career on just reminding yourself about the knowledge work, I think that's when you start to understand what this apparatus, it is not a perfect apparatus, right? It's a fun and good apparatus. And you'll start to get excited about peer review more than fear peer review. I can honestly say I get to have like 9 Christmases a year.
Yeah.
And it's when that letter comes in from the editor and it's like, there's a decision made on your paper, and you get it on your phone, I pull over the car, and look at the reviews. It is a fun feeling either way.
It is. And you just students, so you don't have to do that 9 times a year. So,
No, you do not.
that's your pace. But it's true. And you have to be suited for it, because let's face it, most people in the world think we're nuts because they do not want to do research or would not enjoy that.
Right.
But we do. And one of the central things is curiosity. You said you would take less money for it. I will just keep doing it even after I don't imagine
That's the other one. You just don't leave. Yeah.
not able to, I don't know, I have grandkids or something. Someday I will still be like designing studies or something, because it's compelling, it's compulsive,
Well, you've been answering
wanna
questions
know.
about reality for so long that you just don't turn it off, right? It's not for everybody. And that's maybe the last one. It's not for everybody. And it's okay. There are other ways to be involved in this work that don't always require sitting in our chairs. And I'm starting to talk to my students about that. Maybe just peer review isn't your game. And then you might think of ways to be involved in the endeavor in other ways. But yeah, it's not something to fear. And, if you don't like it, one thing that we forget is that we are in charge of it. And as Pollyannish as it might sound, one of the best ways to fix peer review is start where you're sitting. And I've seen this at like newer conferences where they have a new group of people and they're doing their reviews. We have control over it. And so a lot of it's reciprocity. A lot of it is breaking down the expectations or raising up the expectations. And so that you do get the long peer review. And those things are happening even in a time where we're recognizing the cost of labor and being careful to protect our time, So we have control over these things. It's a very karmic thing. When you give a lot of feedback for a journal and then you see your feedback coming in. It really does. You said something earlier about remembering your reviews. I think folks would be surprised how often you do remember a good review. Like it really does stick with you. The lesson sticks with you. And it's almost, honestly, it's like going back to class again. I mean, sometimes you do, because the person reviewing it, right? They're supposed to be an expert in this, as are you, but sometimes they're a very nuanced expert. So they might say, oh, well, I have some newer work on this, and this. Those are the frustrating reviews, but they're also the ones where you write it again, and you look at your paper and you're like, okay, that was
Yeah,
the
and
missing
I feel
ingredient.
like when you get over the, there's part of you that's, I don't know if it's lazy, but you just want your paper published and you'd like to walk away. But then when you get that information, there's part of me that thinks no one could give me a better gift than that, because they've taken the thing that I am obsessed with and they've given me detailed feedback on it, and no one else is going to do that.
And that is our job, right? Like, it's the best part of conferences. I was going to say that earlier when I'm looking at journal selections. I often think about who's on editorial boards and who have I interacted with at conferences, not from a tit for tat perspective, but I know what kind of feedback they give people because I hear it verbally, right? But you're right. You get the world's 3 experts in narrative and VR gaming and Moss, who are suddenly exchanging anonymous emails, going to great lengths to educate each other on this one topic. It makes for some pretty cool stuff. And, some of this, and maybe a overarching point, if you research things you like, you're probably less likely to fear peer review, because it's really, I want to go to that club of 3 people, right? Whereas if you find yourself maybe in the paper mill, where you're kind of chasing manuscripts and chasing citations, that is probably where peer review is not any fun, because you're not that invested in the paper. You're just sort of going through the motions, and it's annoying, But yeah, I get a reviewer who wants to talk about historical nostalgia and retro games. Yeah. And I'm like, you know me. We don't agree, exactly. But you know me. That's so cool. And so I'm glad you reminded me of that, because that is something that we, academics in public usually out themselves because we geek out on something pretty quickly, right? And that is what's often happening in the peer review process. And so maybe reminding yourself as the author, not necessarily yelling at you, they're just emotional. Like, they're excited to talk about this, and that might manifest in various ways. And as you said, the editor will give you guidance. If it's not a reject, it's not a reject. Okay. I always tell people that, like, and even if it is a reject, nothing says you can't email them back. But if it's not a reject, it's a conversation. And if it's a conversation, you have agency. And so double down and engage that agency.
Yeah, and I will say, I feel like, because as the editor, you see everything that's inside that machine, you see all the reviews, all the papers. Yeah. Most of the time at PPM, they are not acerbic or impolite, uncivil reviews. Every once in a while, someone just really starts to get agitated, and then, and then they escalate.
Right.
But mostly, the thing that I'm more surprised about, they keep the tone fine, but the thing I'm more surprised about is 2 people who both know what they're doing see the paper completely differently. Yeah. And then you're left with the decision, which is fine.
Right.
Before we end, I want to mention one more thing. A lot of times I think that authors get upset if they read 2 reviews that seem relatively positive, and then you are making a different decision, or you were more harsh. It's not a vote, right? So right. It's not like 2 people said yes, now it's published. Because if you have a 92% rejection rate or whatever, it may be a decent paper, it may be good, they may have not that much bad to say about it, but you can't publish all of those. You're only publishing 8%, so, or whatever the percent is. So the editor who's handling that, they know everything about the journal, how many papers they can accept, what's the rejection rate, what are the topics that have been put in. And even if your 2 reviewers really liked it, somebody pushed back at me once and was like, hey, these 2 reviewers really liked it. And I said, like, you can submit another one. I don't want you to feel like you've been, messed over here. But I went through their thing like blow by blow, because what I was saying is, I have read all these other papers and I see that the level that they're at, and I see that yours is not at that level. And even if your 2 reviewers were positive, I am seeing across, they're not seeing what I'm seeing. So, and it's not a contract. Like, if you can get 2 people to say yes, then those are the things they get in the journal. That's
a really important lesson for all of us, especially early career scholars, because it's something you wouldn't know unless you did it for a while. It is a bit of a zero-sum game, right? There's a limited amount of space. And even when we go digital, that space is not going to get bigger for various reasons. And that's a whole conversation in itself. One of them being, quite frankly, we can't, if we publish everything, then nothing is science, right? I mean, if everything is published, then we can't sort through it all. There are quality checks. I have, as editor, at times, had to do what you did and rejected a paper. And I've even gone so far as to say, this might fit somewhere else. One of the most memorable reviews for me was an editor who rejected a paper of mine that the reviewers liked, suggested another journal, and I submitted it to that journal and it made it in. And they weren't playing around. They were like, I think this with a little more nuance, it should go here. But I like your point about it. It's not a vote, it's an advisement. I actually try to tell my reviewers to not comment in the comments on accept, reject, because I'm like,
Right, exactly.
it's not really your role. Like, your role is to advise me, but I have to make the decision. There's also public and private facing comments, right? I might email Dr. Shackleford because I have a question that I don't want to write to the author because it may seem accusatory, but I want to find out from her what she thinks about something because we're in the field, right?
Yes, we often get those notes that are just to us, and they're not knowing that we got that note. So
exactly. The other one is that sometimes reviewers will they'll write a very nice set of comments to the author.
Yep.
And then they'll write to me and they'll yell.
Exactly.
On the one hand, they're doing it so they don't yell at the author, but it's almost not, it's too corrective because now their public facing comments are like, oh, this is pretty cool. Fix this, fix this. And their comments to me are, don't publish this.
Exactly.
It can't be fixed. So I always tell reviewers, like, please don't do that. Like, I'd rather you not do that. It's okay. It's being critical is not being mean. Policing tone doesn't mean you can't be critical. It's really more about personalizing the content versus customizing the content.
Which is also true on paper feedback. As a professor, you're not saying, I don't like you or you're dumb. Right. You're saying, I know what the world is like out there, and I don't want to send you out there not ready to deal with it.
Right. If this comment's read, skin your knees here, don't skin your knees there. Right. And it's very similar. And I've actually, as editor, said that before, where I've told an author, like, I don't think you want this published. I know you want it published for certain reasons, but your name's going to be on it. And I'm telling you, these reviewers are making a valid point. Your rebuttal isn't very strong, and it's not strong to the point where it's easily refutable, because ideally the review process is a microcosm of the field. So whatever they're saying, there's some probability that other folks would say it too. And if you don't have a rebuttal privately in that review chain, you're not going to be able to have a rebuttal publicly. In fact, at PPM, the prior editor, I had a paper published on identification and polythetic, and then we got a criticism published, and then I had a response to the criticism. That was awesome, because it meant, first, I got to take a bunch of stuff from the review letter and go, all right, let's do this publicly, right? But you have to be prepared to do that. Yeah. So sometimes
some of our people who are watching this may not know that happens, and I think it does happen more in some areas than others. Like, my mentor is a media violence scholar, so just automatically there are going to be rebuttals and there's going to be fights. But I always used to joke, like, if you're writing about the self or something, people are like, fine, I don't care what you say about that. And it's not, I think the self is fascinating. It's just that some areas evoke criticism, like,
for various reasons.
For various reasons. But our students watching may not know this. Some people will actually publish sort of a commentary, like, these authors said this, and here's what's wrong with that. And then the people who wrote the original paper invited to then speak back to that.
Right. And that's, again, that is part of science. I mean, it really is. And I guess that's if there was one takeaway from this conversation, it's that I'm not saying negativity is part of science. I'm saying criticism, rejection, and debate are science. We learned in 6th grade the scientific method, but that method we learned, that cycle always resulted in knowledge because it presumed you were doing it right. Thing is, it's hard to do right, and it is meant to be self-corrective. And so it is really important that folks realize that you are entering, and I really do, recognizing the gender and underpinnings of this, there's so many analogies to athletic performance.
I'm glad you use baseball, because we're both from the St. Louis area, and the one team sport I know is baseball.
But you get it, right? Like, you coach. At some point, I remember I coached Little League and I coached like little tykes, and we don't drill them on the importance of winning it. But when they got to like select baseball when they were 16, then you had to have the conversation about why you're not playing, or why this person's playing, or why this person's doing this, or what makes it good. There is a level of standard that for us to accept something as a knowledge claim, it's got to survive. And it's got to survive when you're not around, right? So for all of those reasons, everything I write, I am thrilled to write. But Karen, I'll tell you, I still get nervous. I sent in 2 R&Rs this week because I have a couple papers under review at PPM. I get nervous clicking the button today still. It will have zero effect on my position at Syracuse, but that's not the point, right? It was an intense dialogue. It was a fun dialogue, and I want to know what they say.
Right.
I want to know what the editor says, right?
You know how in politics people will say, "Oh, you flip-flopped," that's called learning.
Called learning, exactly. Sometimes you're like, you know what, you were right.
There's some, you do this sometimes. Sometimes I'll read a past writing of mine and I'll think, oh, I'm embarrassed about that. Like either I've changed my mind or something. And then sometimes I'll read it and be like, hey, that's good. Did I write that? Oh my God.
Who wrote that? Oh, I know who wrote that. Oh, absolutely. And that's going to happen because we also, and then this is another like lesson in the lesson. Sometimes we think knowledge is static, and we see this a lot when ECRs become mid-career scholars. And then they think, okay, that's how it is. Not really. I mean, open science wasn't a thing when we were in graduate school. And now we have a whole new line of procedures with publication.
I'm so guilty of that. I have to be nudged like, all right, it's changing. Okay. I guess I need to.
It's just not our thing, right? Or like certain modeling, Bayesian analyses and null testing. We're like, that wasn't a thing when we were doing this stuff. So, not only is it self-correcting at the review level, but science self-corrects at the science level. And so, the idea of the lifelong learner, I mean, we have to embrace that as well. And so for me, peer review is in some small way, both the papers I just sent in, I can legitimately say I learned something from the reviewers. I was like, you know what? That's a really neat idea. And on the flip side, this goes back to my old job in the media. If you submitted a manuscript to your newspaper and your editor didn't make comments, that's because you were getting fired.
Oh no.
Because that was like, I am not even reading this from you.
I'm done with you. Yeah.
I'm done with you. I have never had a paper accepted. Just accepted.
Yeah. No.
And at JMP, in my entire editorship, we have never accepted a paper on first submission. I have never heard of it. I mean, I'm sure it happens occasionally.
It happened to my ex-husband. And it was very funny because it was in the 90s and I don't remember the journal, but it was a famous psychologist. And it was like when we had to physically mail.
Oh, sure.
And it like literally fell behind a desk and had a weird stain on it. And then he got it back. He got it back and it was like, we're accepting it. Now it was like that famous psychologist's pet theory. And this was like a little nuanced part of it.
Sure.
So he was probably like, sold.
I like this. But yeah, as we know, it's rare, right? And I think sometimes students especially aren't used to that. Like when you and I get rejected and rebutted on a daily basis. And at some point it comes into your email, it comes through social media, it comes through. So it's just an accepted occupational hazard, except that it's not really a hazard. It's just part of the gig.
I pretty much left media balance work right after my dissertation. I was on my own and I was like, I'm going to do gender and race stuff. And then I moved into narrative. But because my dissertation was on violent video game effects, I have been called everything and, just no holds barred. So I have a new colleague, Andreas Miles Novella, who was one of Craig's students as well. And we're just like, there's nothing you can say to shock us, like that was, in a way, I'm happy about that. Like, and again, people don't come after me like, why are you defending, bad, why are you saying that it's not good to be racist? Or, people don't come after me for that. No. I'm like, no, I think it is good to be racist.
Right. This is exactly this. So,
but it
and
is
of course,
like,
it means you're making impact, right? It means you're making impact. Your work's making impact. People care. Right? I really try to recast all this process as a matter of impact. I'd rather have students in my class being argumentative than being quiet, and I take that to this whole process.
For media violence, it's interesting. I don't think, I think people just think it's simplistic or something, but
sure.
if I were to go back and do any media violence work, what I would want to know is, I'm curious as to whether it's really more about power and control than about harm. Like that when you play a game, and I love The Legend of Zelda, all those games. I'm like, I'm just sorting people, like I'm just
Yeah.
sorting shrubbery. It's not like I don't play those games or something, but everything is nuanced and different. And in our lives, we have so little control, and to
Mhm.
have control, to have autonomy, to have mastery, all of those things. Um, I'm curious about that.
There's an analogy in sports that people get so mad about cheating because they expect the only place that the world is fair is on the field
Mhm.
because there's rules. It turns out that's not true at all. And so when the rules are violated, they get incredibly mad because they're like, you told me this would be just and it's not just. Or same reason you like drama, right? It's the restorative property. So it would not surprise me very much. And you're right, you would ask that question, you would do that study, and you would publish that paper, and you would have dialogue, right? Like it's that
And
that
I,
is
and
our
I think
process.
about it over the years, and I've come to conclude that in my own work, the entire line, it may seem weird, like I was in media violence and now I'm in narrative. The entire line is like my view that we have real meaningful experiences with media, that it's not nothing if you say terrible things to people in a video game, and it's not nothing if you watch a show and you're crying because you've learned a lesson. It can be
There's something
deeply,
there.
like sometimes we just are not into it, but sometimes it's deeply moving. And that's the whole arc of my career. Like when people say, that's why I wrote How Fantasy Becomes Reality, that people would say, oh, adults know the difference between fiction and
Not
nonfiction.
really.
So end of story. I'm like, no,
No, not at all.
that
And
is not it.
to that note, that's a nice reminder as we're trying to find the well-being resources to get through those rough stages, those critique points, those points of perceived failure. Sometimes remembering that helps. So as much as we tend to think that the career story is only useful for tenure and promotion, it's an anchor point. It's good to remind yourself while you're doing this, because if you lose track of that, if you lose track of that story, this can be harder. And I think for ECRs and for graduate students, you haven't quite developed that story yet. And so the rejection just feels totally personal because it doesn't have the end goal is get degree, get job, because you haven't quite developed the focus. But if you can develop the narrative that you think you're going to tell or that you want to tell, it does make all the other processes make a lot more sense. So then when I get the paper back, I go, oh, okay, I'm trying to tell the story of why younger people have nostalgia for games that they weren't around when they were children.
Mhm.
Maybe I need to tweak this argument so that story becomes clear. Instead of you POS, I'm going to fix this paper and fix you, right? Or when,
Yeah, so tell me, by the way, I need to know, why do young people who were, my son is absolutely like this. He has the nostalgia for all these different games that he wasn't alive for.
yeah, so we think what we're seeing is it is for media appreciation. It's the same reason I watch movies from the 40s.
Mhm.
They have an aesthetic, an appeal, and a time capsule for a bygone era that I wasn't part of. It's the same reason that I listen to my father's music, right? I attach not autobiographical memories, but I start to expand who I think I am as a consumer and as a person. So gamers, people who have high efficacy with games and see themselves as like, I play video games. Well, to be a gamer doesn't just mean you own a lot of games. It means you can talk about the history, talk about the culture, talk about the aesthetics. The medium's finally old enough to have that. My students don't have this controller in their living room, but I have it in my office. And when
Yeah,
they see it, they attach an aesthetic that's not my aesthetic.
right.
And so in a way, the research is a privilege of time. I just happen to be researching it at a time where this newer generation is just far enough removed from that physical medium of the 80s and 90s, the pre-digital turn, to where now you also see this, by the way, in religion, the waves of Catholicism, where you have like the people who want the physical rosary and they want to receive the sacrament and do it in the church. Then there's the new age that goes away from all that. And then what you see is this return back to its roots, to where like the fourth generation goes, oh man, the rosary's so cool.
Yeah.
This part's so cool. We're seeing that with games. So
And we
it's
were both raised in that culture. So,
you get that, yeah,
ethnically,
where
I
it's
always
like,
see that Midwestern Catholic stuff.
yep.
But I love nostalgia, and my husband's 9 years older than I am, and he teaches film, and he's a screenwriter and playwright. And so we watch a whole lot. We're watching all these different. We recently discovered Barbara Stanwyck, who I knew like
Yeah,
almost
yeah.
nothing about. We're just watching all these Barbara Stanwyck films. A couple nights ago, we were watching something that was made in like 1930 or something. And I was thinking, some of these people were born in 1880 and we
Yep.
still, like, it was a very good cut. We could like a remastering or something. We could
Uh-huh.
see them. Like, so I am looking at a person who's supposed to be in their 20s or something, and they were born in
Yeah.
two, in 2 centuries ago, or whatever. And that's important to me. So when you were speaking, I was thinking of that's helping me tell the story of American history, of culture, of different things. Of I don't know what it's like to have been an adult in 1940, but I know some things, like from films, I know some things about slang or
Absolutely.
mores, the way people dressed. And I find it very soothing. There's a ton of sexism, which I'm always
Oh
calling out,
gosh,
like
yeah. Yeah,
women are
you have to
super
turn that light on
dumb
and
and
off.
all that. Like you can't like think, and you're supposed to look at, but I'm not mad at them for that. It's not good, but I'm not mad. It's over, and it was what it was. But there's so much I feel like is soothing still about that era. For some reason, even though I love technology, I just love to walk into a room where there's just a pencil and a paper and a desk and
That's
nobody's
what these
on their
kids would talk
phone.
about. They often in the quality, so we do a lot of mixed method research, right? And on the qualitative side, they would talk about this is what my parents' games were like. This was what it was like to go down in the basement and write codes on a piece of paper, right?
Mhm.
It's that connection to a greater self. And so we're seeing that nostalgia might serve this social well-being role where it connects people in a metaphorical sense, where they're
Mhm.
like, okay, I have a place here. My parents and I aren't so different. They weren't so different than me. And especially in times where people are feeling isolated, it's become a pretty powerful motivator. And we were just trying to explain the economic forces behind this stuff, and
Mhm.
that's where we're at now. And that's an example of a story that it was a hard story to tell, and so the reviewers needed to help us tell it a little better, because oftentimes we think internally, right? And we need some help unpacking that. There are times I'm sure you and I have written a paper where you write something that makes perfect sense for somebody who's been doing this for 5 years. But to an external reader, they're like, these words,
Right.
none of those terms are like used by humans.
Yeah, I once wrote in a book, I think it was Mad Men Unzipped. I wrote, because I think about this a lot with my husband, teaching people to write and acting and being in that side of it, whereas I'm looking at the audience perspective. I said that, like, I was talking about Mad Men, so I was saying Elizabeth Moss co-creates the role of that
Right.
character. So I know what it's like. My husband writes something on the page. He's the writer, right? And then there's the director, and then there's the actor. And what it turns out to look like to us comes together from all of those creative
Right.
individuals, and they're all people. And so she is co-creating that. The looks on her face, everything she's doing is bringing Peggy, the character, to life. And it was the one of the editors at the publishing house. She said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And
Right.
that still bugs me because I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not like,
Right. I'm like,
that's
I
what this is.
yeah.
And I'm like, what's not clear about that? You have the words on the page. It's like the fundamental attribution error. When you see the actress, you think Elizabeth is wholly responsible for everything that is being said there, or Peggy, but you don't know who wrote
The
that,
apparatus
who
behind it.
directed
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
that all goes into this one constellation that we then see, and take the fundamental attribution error that's only the person, which
Yeah.
I do. Anyway, this was going to be a 5 minute interview about journals, but we got talking, and I think it is great. I am going to post this on my YouTube channel, and
Cool.
your students can watch it. Anybody could, your
Yeah,
grandma,
share the link
anyone can
whenever
watch
it's
it.
ready, and I'll this actually could be really helpful. They're slotting me. My role at Newhouse is going to be the first year methods courses, which I'm excited about. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about that. And this will be good for them because they have a lot of questions. And I also think there's a lot of misinformation out there about, I'm not a Pollyanna about the academy, but I also think that some of our troubles are overblown. And I'm trying to help them strike a balance between, the things to expect that are acceptable and the things that aren't. This is one of the things that's totally acceptable, no more than I can hit every ball. It's just not gonna, we would, if a batter hit 600, like baseball would close. They're like,
That
we
would be
can't do
like
this.
if a little league game was playing in a
That's
and
right. Yeah.
man
They'd
came
be like,
on.
we're out of oranges. We're done. Like we're done. Right. This is going to be really helpful, I think. And thanks for giving me a chance to kind of think about that stuff. I haven't thought about it that deeply in a while. And
That
it's about,
was so great talking to you. It's very intellectually stimulating. You have to schedule, pencil me into your schedule now and then we'll have an
yeah, of
intellectual
course. Yeah,
conversation that we can share with our students.
absolutely. No, I love to
We'll,
do
we'll
that.
talk about that other stuff we're going to meet about at some other some other point.
Well, I give you a super quick update.
Let me hit stop.
Yeah.
Business
Oh,
meeting.
yeah. Sorry.
Anyway, thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed it.
No worries.